Well, fancy finding you here. When people think of the home Odysseus spends 10 years trying to return to, they think of the Greek island of Ithaca. It's got the right name, it even has ancient coins with his name and archaeological sites associated with worship or at least reverence of the legendary king. Tourists have visited this tiny western island of Greece for millennia because of its association with Homer's epic poem. There's just one teensy-weensy problem. It might not be the same place as the mythical one. There is a decades-long argument between archaeologists, geologists, and historians over not only whether Homer's Ithaca was or wasn't modern Ithaca at all, but also whether it even exists at all. This caught my eye in the sea of Odyssey content following the release of Chris Nolan's latest film. And so I went digging in to the puzzle of the real Ithaca and where it might be. If archaeological mysteries like this sound like they're right up your trench, keep watching and let's dig in to the archaeology of Ithaca. One small disclaimer I will say is that I don't have any training in speaking either modern or ancient Greek, so I've done my best with the pronunciations, but please forgive me if they're incorrect. My usual executive producer, Emma, is upstairs sleeping on my bed this afternoon when I'm filming, so she might or may not deign to show up in a cameo today. However, don't worry, I'm going to pay the cat tax just now.
Say hello to your adoring public.
People have been connecting real-life locations and discoveries back to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Heinrich Schliemann did this most famously, if actually incorrectly, at the sites of Mycenae and Troy. And while his initial discoveries were wildly misdated and actually belong to periods that predate the conflict, there is some very scant evidence that the Trojan War might have been inspired by a real event. You can watch my video collaboration with Dig It with Raven if you want to learn more about that. But when it comes to the Odyssey, no definitive archaeological evidence has been found to show that it actually happened, though that hasn't stopped anyone from trying to find said evidence and prove that the epic myth is actually based in reality. Pretty much the only argument for the Odyssey being real is the surprising amount of geographic detail written about the various locations that Odysseus visits in his journey. Some of them have been connected to locations in Greece, Italy, Tunisia, the Maltese archipelago, and the Iberian Peninsula. However, scholars both ancient and modern are divided on whether any of them were real. Let's not forget the more fantastical parts of the myth, like the Cyclops, the Lastrygonians, witches and gods and demigods, who are all major elements of the story. If we're going to dismiss them as fantasy, then should we really be taking the rest of the story as truth? Flint Dibble will be speaking more on this point later in the video. The great Greek geographer, try saying that 3 times fast, Eratosthenes, even said, "You will find the scene of Odysseus's wanderings when you find the cobbler who sewed up the bag of winds." So you can imagine the skepticism with which this topic is approached. So what does the epic poem actually say about Odysseus's home? In Book 9, he describes it to the ruler of the Phaeacians, a people living on an island that we generally assume to be modern Corfu. He says, "Bright Ithaca is my home. It has a mountain, leaf-quivering Neriton, far visible. Around are many islands close to each other, Thulihion and Samos and wooded Zakynthos. Ithaca itself lies low, furthest to sea, towards dusk. The rest, apart, face dawn and sun." This description gives us 3 important clues to the location of Ithaca. 1, it's near 3 other islands. 2, it's low-lying, as in it's not very mountainous or super hilly. And 3, it lies to the west of these islands, furthest to the sea. Based on this verse, the Greek geographer Strabo, who was writing in the 1st century CE, which is around 700-ish years after the Odyssey was composed, and then even longer after when the people in it may have actually lived, identified Homer's Ithaca by interpreting the words about it being low-lying to mean it was close to the mainland, and the phrase translated as farthest out to sea towards dusk as meaning farthest of all towards the north. I'm not an expert in Greek languages or translating it, but I don't really know how he got from A to B there. Then he looked at identifying the mentioned neighboring islands. The island of Zakynthos has pretty much always been known by this name, so that one was pretty easy. He then theorized that Samos was modern Kefalonia, and Thuhilion was one of the islands now known as the Echinathes. Therefore, based on this interpretation of the text, he labeled ancient Ithaca as being the island that we now call Ithaca, as it's the most northerly of all the islands in this group, and it's the closest to the mainland. This identification also matches with the Hellenistic and Roman belief that this place was Ithaca, which we can actually see in the archaeological record. Coins from around the 4th to 2nd centuries BCE found in Ithaca frequently portray Odysseus, and an inscription from the 3rd century BCE at the city of Magnesia, which is in modern Turkey, refers to an Ithacan hero shrine of Odysseus and games called the Odyssey. Side note, what kind of games or sports do you think that they would have played there? Endurance boat races, Cyclops chases, or maybe an ancient version of Taskmaster? Let me know your ideas in the comments. Archaeologists have spent 2 decades on Ithaca excavating the site known as Agios Athanasios, aka the School of Homer, which can be found high on the terrace slopes of Mount Exochi on Ithaca. It is divided into 2 terraces, which are connected by 2 carved staircases, and at its core is a large rocky formation in an area with water springs. The upper terrace is dominated by the remains of a Hellenistic tower from the 3rd century BCE, while most of the lower terrace is occupied by a large rectangular building that's been divided into 3 sections, which is a style that's reminiscent to Mycenaean palaces that we see on the mainland. Additionally, a nearby subterranean storeroom was used for food storage, indicating that there was advanced planning and resource management here. The site is further fortified by Cyclopean walls of defense, which feature 4 gates, emphasizing the strategic and protective measures of the ancient inhabitants. The oldest evidence of human activity at the School of Homer actually comes from the final Neolithic period in the late 5th to 4th millennium BCE, and it consists of several dozen flint artifacts as well as several hundred pottery fragments. The largest volume of ceramic material dates back to the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, and includes 8 fragments of ritual stone water basins, which were used for purification and sacred water in sanctuaries. There are also 34 fragments of clay offerings, some gold and bronze jewelry, and more than 100 coins from various cities, demonstrating how popular this place was with ancient tourists. An inscribed votive offering and stamped roof tile stood out as they bear the name of Odysseus. A late Roman bronze bust was found here in 1904, and it has certain characteristics of Odysseus, such as his distinctive hat, which is a brimless felt conical cap known as a pilos or pilus or pileus, that was commonly used by sailors, craftsmen, and travelers. All of these findings have led to the identification of the site as a Greco-Roman shrine to Odysseus, possibly the one mentioned in the Magnesia inscription. But just because ancient people thought this island was Homer's Ithaca, that doesn't really prove that it was. So we need to look into archaeological evidence contemporary with the Mycenaean period that the Odyssey may or may not have taken place in. As I briefly mentioned, the School of Homer does contain archaeological remains dating to the Bronze/Mycenaean age. And besides the potential palace, also found here are several dozen fragments from approximately 30 different ceramic vessels of the late 14th and 13th centuries BCE, as well as an intact underground fountain/cistern that contained late Mycenaean kylix fragments. However, none of this evidence is directly linkable to Odysseus. It's thought that this settlement probably supervised the nearby ports and land and/or protected and managed the rich water resources of the area. It seems to be part of a network of 7 to 8 Mycenaean sites in the northwest of Ithaca, which roughly defines the major area of the urban center of the island during the Mycenaean palatial period. I will also say that this site can be really difficult to research because it hasn't been published, and so all the material for it is online and is quite contradictory. Some of it says that it has Odysseus's palace, which dates to the 8th century BCE, but also that the two-terrace complex is a Mycenaean palace, which belongs to Odysseus, and it's really difficult to sift your way through the information. What I've spoken about here comes from the official press releases from the Greek Office of Antiquities, and in that there is no definite connection between the site of the School of Homer and the original Odysseus. It's pretty clear that modern Ithaca has been considered Odysseus's home for a very long time. And since ancient people lived much closer to the myth than we do, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that they've probably got it right. But other scholars have questioned this presumption, primarily based on the fact that modern Ithaca doesn't match the description of it in Odysseus very well, mostly because it is very mountainous and it faces east, not west, as you would expect from a place as being described as towards dusk. In the early 2000s, Robert Biddleston published a book on his theory that Ithaca isn't even an island, but a western peninsula of Kefalonia called Paliki, which does face west, is low-lying, and is the most western of all of that group of islands in that description. He went so far as to identify potential candidate sites on Paliki for the palace, the harbor, and the site of Odysseus's homecoming, the Bay of Phorcys. However, one flaw that undermined his entire argument was his assumption that Ithaca was an island, and therefore he concluded that in order for Paliki to be a match, it had to have been an island in the late Bronze Age. His proposed solution was that Paliki was separated from Kefalonia by a marine channel that had since been filled up by rock and landslides. However, this proposal was not supported by geological evidence, but it did lead a geoscientist from the University of Aberdeen to partner up with a classicist professor from the University of Cambridge to re-examine the Homeric texts for other clues. And in July 2026, the pair published the article which questions whether or not Ithaca was even an island at all. The basis of their argument is that Homer never directly refers to Ithaca as an island. He instead uses the words Gaia, which means land, Patris, which means native land, or Demos, which means country or domain. And these are the words that he uses to describe it, not the word island. For example, a verse from Book 13 says, "Then the seafaring ship approached the island. In the country of Ithaca there is a bay of Phorcys, the old man of the sea, in it 2 headlands." The new theory argues that this phrasing, where Homer refers to Ithaca directly as a demos or a country and not an island, implies that Ithaca is merely part of a larger island that the ship is approaching, rather than an entire island itself. Their full article has several other examples where Homer's reference to Ithaca could be read as describing it differently or separate from other islands. Another example is this passage where Telemachus lists the suitors of Penelope and says, "All of the noble lords who rule the islands, Thuhilion and Samos and wooded Zakynthos, and all who rule in rocky Ithaca." The authors ask the question that if Ithaca was an independent island, why are the other 3 grouped together and then Ithaca is separate, last, and not called an island? And why are the other trio never described as the other islands if they are all islands? The scholars have thus concluded that Homer never describes Ithaca directly as an island, and there is no evidence that he thought it was one. Therefore, they think that Homeric Ithaca was a peninsula joined to a larger landmass, sometimes called the mainland, effectively an island with 2 parts, the country of Ithaca in the west and Samos in the east, together making up Kefalonia, aka modern Kefalonia. A point in their favor here is that in the Iliad, Odysseus is referred to as the leader of the gallant Cephalonians. Overall, they think that this strengthens the possibility that Paliki on Kefalonia was the location of Homer's Ithaca. To add some weight to their argument, recent geophysical surveys and preliminary excavations of Levadi March, Odysseus's proposed harbor on Paliki, have confirmed that it was suitable as a safe harbor in the late Bronze Age, and has also found settlement evidence dating to the early Bronze Age, a tantalizing hint that this area was actively settled and used by humans around the right time. Nearby Krikelos Hill has been identified by several sources as having the characteristics of size, scale, and location that could make it suitable for a late Bronze Age settlement. But so far, the trial excavations here have only found an ancient storeroom, a wheel-shaped object, and a Roman sestertius, all of which are dated to the current era, so a few thousand years too late for Odysseus. But that doesn't mean more work won't find Bronze Age remains in future. However, just like the school of Homer, none of this definitively links to the legendary king, and many scholars would say that we shouldn't be taking Homer's epics so literally. Dr. Flint Dibble is here to tell us more. Let's dig in to what he has to say.
So Flint, welcome to the channel. Thanks for speaking to me today about the Odyssey and Ithaca. Can you just introduce yourself to the viewers who I'm sure probably do know you, but in case they don't, what's your background in Greece and the Odyssey, and what are your qualifications exactly to talk about this?
At my core, as a researcher and an archaeologist, I am an archaeologist that focuses on ancient Greece. I've been excavating in the ancient Greek world since 2003 in Ukraine, but in Greece itself since 2007. I've held numerous fellowships and postdocs in Greece. I've lived in Athens for 7 years total, and I've excavated in Athens, in Corinth, at Pylos, at Mycenae, at Knossos. I've studied materials at Azoriot, Nicoria. I could go on. I also have a PhD, a master's, and a BA from classics departments. So I read ancient Greek, and I've read the Odyssey and the Iliad in ancient Greek. I have taught them in translation.
Way more qualified than me to speak on this, which is why I brought you in today. Can you start us off by talking about or explaining the issues with around this idea of using the Odyssey and the text itself to try and pinpoint or identify it to real locations around the Mediterranean?
A lot of people, particularly on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and whatnot, and a lot of popular people in their imaginations, they want to take this myth as literal. So there's a real tempting thing to do with that, because there's kernels of truth there. Mycenae is a real place. Troy is a real place, right? And we have the archaeology of it. And so there's even more detailed glimpses into the past, like they describe the boar's tusk helmets, which we have archaeological examples of. And so you take these kernels of truth that we can that are tangible, and then you say, wait, can we try to find more of this kind of stuff? And this is where the danger starts occurring, because if we start reading the Iliad and the Odyssey in a very literal way, we start all of a sudden realizing it doesn't work. So, for example, Sue Sherritt was one of the people that really opened, she's a retired professor from Sheffield. She was one of the people that really opened this field, and she looked at the armor and the weapons in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And what she realized is that you have armor and weapons that match what we find archaeologically from periods from 1600 BC, 1200 BC, and 800 BC. So you have these different shields, these tower shields or these smaller shields. You have, for example, different kind of spears, like handed spears versus a throwing spear that we see in the Iron Age. And both of these are described within these poems. So if you take them literally, all of a sudden you realize these details match all sorts of stuff, right? And then you have all sorts of things that are very clearly magical and mythical and imaginary, let's say. And so when you start looking at locations on the ground, so for example, if you want to extend this to geography, if you look at the Troad, so the area around Troy, Homer describes the 8 rivers that we know around Troy, but he gets their placement wrong and the way that they flow wrong. So there's real stuff there, but then also poetic, mythical stuff that doesn't jive with what we have geographically. And there's good reasons for this, because this is a poem that's in epic meter. So the key thing that a poet needs to do is make sure that the words they're using match that meter at all times. And so what that means is the spear can shift from Bronze Age to Iron Age within a line. Sue Sherrod has an example of that happening. You'll just get a description that isn't literal because it's poetic. A good example of this is these epithets, where it's these adjectives that constantly get applied to places and people. High-walled Troy, swift-footed Achilles. These all match the meter, and then you get ones that don't quite match literally what you'd expect. So something like a sandy Pylos. I've excavated at Pylos. There's no sand at all near the Palace of Nestor at Pylos. It's all clay. And so if you're going to take these details literally to try to solve a riddle of where Ithaca is, you're reading something that isn't meant to be read literally.
Yeah. Also, I think kind of touch on the fact that when you were talking about like the difference in the weapons and the dating, the fact that it started off as an oral poem and then was written down, and also the fact that we don't even, Homer, the Homeric question, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the fact that we actually potentially have multiple authors contributing this to this as well? So it's not like a pristine text that's come down from one person to present day.
Oh, it's even worse than that, Rachel. Scholars are 99.99999% sure that A, this is an oral tradition that was passed on for centuries before it was written down. So what that means is that it's a poem that passes from person to person and gets adapted and modified. In fact, most people think it's probably multiple poems that were eventually compiled together. And this is why you get this kind of repetition of stuff. You can see this in the epithets, which they match to oral poetry in modern societies, right? And so there's all these hidden clues. Another one, for example, is we have dialects. There's the remnants of a letter that disappeared in Greek by the time this got written down. It's called digamma. And so it's pronounced like a w. So you know that in the Hittite tablets, how Troy is called Wilusa? Mm-hmm. That's the digamma there in Greek. Wilusa. Ilion is what it's called in the poems. And so we have these words where we know the digamma has disappeared because of how it matches the meter. It's in the meter as if the digamma is still there, but there is no digamma anymore because that word isn't written down anymore. So we know it comes from this earlier oral tradition when they had these letters and these pronunciations that no longer existed by the time the text was written down. And guess what? It gets even worse than that. It gets even worse because the text was modified even after it was written down originally. So even if there's one person or maybe two people that wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, or multiple or whatever, it changes for centuries after that. So there's this period in Athens when Pisistratus was the tyrant in the late 6th century BC, and we see changes to the poems that reflect the politics of that time. Athens and Athena get more prominent roles. Or if you look at the catalog of ships, we think of this as it's a list of the different city-states then palaces that sent troops to Troy. This is book 3 of the Iliad. It reflects Bronze Age political settlements, but it also reflects Iron Age and later political settlements. So there's all this manipulation going on where later settlements, they ended up wanting to get into the poems, so they end up in the catalog of ships, for example. And then there's even more in the Hellenistic period in the Library of Alexandria. We have all these scholia, which is basically scholars who study these poems, who write notes in the margins. And we know even at that period, there were multiple versions circulating, and they were eventually kind of compiled into the singular versions that we have today. So there's just so many different authors and so many different times. It makes it very complicated.
Mm-hmm. I remember actually reading about the Library of Alexandria, and I don't remember what his exact name was, but like the editor of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the guy who kind of is largely responsible for the version as we know it today. You've mentioned a few, but do you have any other kind of like really obvious examples of mismatches between the texts that we have and then some of the places that we've actually identified archaeologically? One
of the big things that always comes up with the Odyssey is, can we map out the places, the mythical places like Scyria or Ai, where Circe's from, the Cyclops Island and stuff like that. And that's one that, like, the descriptions of Scyria just don't friggin' match, right? And so people want to put it in, like, I don't know, Corfu, for example, is a really common attribution for that. Cyclops, an island off of Sicily. People have put Ai, where Circe's from, off the coast of Italy, like Sardinia, Corsica area. And so none of these really match again. People have tried to find these time and time again. But if you want to get it down to the really granular details, the matching of the architecture just doesn't work. The descriptions of what a Bronze Age palace would have looked like simply cannot match a Bronze Age Mycenaean palace as we know them. There's some kernels of truth. There's like a central room with a throne and a hearth. We have that, but the rest of it doesn't make any sense. So if you're familiar at all with sort of Bronze Age palatial architecture, they are these major administrative complexes with sort of linear B tablets and all these sort of rooms devoted to economic activity. And so as an administrative complex, that's different from, say, just a big house, right? With a throne room and whatnot. In Homer, they're described as big houses, essentially, not as these major complexes that you would expect from our understanding of the archaeology. In fact, the entire sort of political economy from Homer is very different from what we have from linear B tablets as well. Even the very term, the kings, Agamemnon and Odysseus, they're referred to as basileus, actually originally wasileus with that digamma. And that's not what they were called in the Bronze Age. They were called awanox. Mm-hmm. And so the basileus was a totally different sort of role. And so we have this kind of very different picture of these spaces in Homer versus what we get and how they functioned versus the archaeology and what we have in the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I've also read or seen, and I'm sure you can probably comment on this as a zooarchaeologist, the idea that the myth of the Cyclops is perhaps inspired by finding elephant skulls. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is an idea. I don't think Adrienne Meyer was the first person to publish on it, but she has a book on fossils in ancient Greece where she popularized this idea. It's one of these things that's based on a lot of circumstantial evidence. It's decent circumstantial evidence. We know that the ancient Greeks and the Romans, we have good, firm textual sources from later on, which record that they've excavated up the bones of heroes and they're giant bones. So the idea here is that they mistook sort of an extinct prehistoric creature, like an elephant or something like that, or a hippo. They thought that these were bones of heroes. Now, there's reasons to maybe doubt that as well. The main reason would be, why would the Greeks be so silly as to think something that looks more like a cow bone would be representing a human? After all, they're pretty familiar with cow bones. And I can tell you that an elephant bone looks kind of like a giant cow bone, much more so than a giant human bone. And so, these weren't idiots. And this is where it can get into my own research, is the ancient Greeks, they actually interacted both in the Bronze Age and in the Iron Age and down. They interacted very closely with skeletal material. So in the Bronze Age, for example, burials were oftentimes secondary context. So they would bury an individual in one place until the flesh deteriorated away, and then they go in there and they'd rearrange the bones. So they collect skulls and stuff like that. They put all the femurs next to one another in a much more organized way. So they knew what human skeletal remains looked like. Similarly, they manipulated heavily ancient animal remains, and this is in the ritual of animal sacrifice, where sort of Homer's sort of contemporary was Hesiod, and he wrote the Theogony, and he wrote the Works and Days, and in there he describes why the ancient Greeks burned bones for the gods, and it's because of Prometheus. Prometheus set up a big barbecue, and he put off to one side the meat wrapped in the intestines, and to the other side, the bones wrapped in glistening, dripping fat. And he said to Zeus, "Which part do you want?" And Zeus knew the trick, but he knew he was being tricked. And so he first chose the bones wrapped in fat, and then he punished Prometheus for it. And then Hesiod explains that's why we burn the bones for the gods. And Homer repeatedly describes this ritual of cutting out specifically the thigh bone. He must describe it like 100 times, wrapping it twice in fat, and then burning it on an altar. And so what's really cool is archaeologically we have all these examples of burned thigh bones at ritual sanctuaries near altars. I've studied a bunch of them. What's also interesting is Homer loves meat eating. His heroes eat an insane amount of meat. They're just barbecuing all the friggin' time. And and what's really cool is in the Iron Age, when he's writing this down, people aren't eating that much animal protein. At this time, it's a very poor period, and we can see from the chemistry of their bones, the organic chemistry of their bones, specifically the isotope ratios, the nitrogen isotope ratios specifically, that people throughout the Iron Age, around the time these poems are written down, they're eating an insanely low amount of animal protein compared to before and after. And so to me, I make this argument in writing and in Twitter threads as well as published stuff, that I think that the meat eating in Homeric epic is not meant to be realistic. It's meant to be basically food porn.
That's great.
And so we need to see this as fiction. It's like if you go and read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, that's full of food porn as well, right? This lavish feast, and you sort of get hungry while reading the Hobbit as they're on, like, their second breakfast and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so it's the same kind of idea there. It's this kind of literary fiction, which, maybe it's oral fiction in this case, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because, like, as you kind of referenced before as well, people really want to only take certain parts of the poems literally. They're happy to be like, okay, can I find a geographic location based on this? But I'm also just going to ignore the fact that there's witches and cyclops and giants and all of that part. Obviously, that's fictional, but this part must be true. So in my last question for you today then is, in your opinion, do you think that Odysseus and Ithaca were real or existed, or why or why not? Where might they be?
I mean, I think that's kind of the wrong question. Okay. I think that's the kind of question that we could never really answer, if you see what I mean. And because people have been trying to figure out the historicity of the Trojan War for 200, 300, more than that years. And there's this popular belief that Schliemann proved the Trojan War existed. He proved that Troy was real. And I want to be really clear, that's not true at all. Like, we already knew Troy was a real place well before Schliemann published about it. And I mean, like, thousands of years beforehand, because Alexander the Great went to Troy. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, went to Troy. Troy had a medieval bishop until like the 12th century or something like that, AD. So, it was a real historical place that scholars knew about well before Schliemann excavated it. And so, the thing is, when we find these things like the boar's tusk helmet or Troy or a destruction level of Troy, it doesn't prove this poem is accurate or not. It proves that it has these aspects of reality that it grafted onto an imaginary fictional story, if you see what I mean. And so that's cool in and of itself. It tells us how these sort of myths come about, but it doesn't prove one thing or the other. It just tells us that there's a relationship here, and that relationship is extremely complicated and nuanced. So I don't think we'll ever be able to find somebody that is Odysseus. And I just like I mentioned before, that we have what's called the Palace of Nestor at Pylos, but it's nothing like is described when Telemachus goes there in Book 3 of the Odyssey. It doesn't look like it. It's not in the right place. It's, he describes it down by the beach when it's actually on this ridge much higher. So, we're just asking the wrong question. It's like trying to say, we know we have New York City, so that proves that Batman is based in reality. The people creating Batman and writing Batman are freely basing stuff of Gotham off of New York City, while mixing and mingling it with imaginary sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's a great allegory, and very interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's given me some food for thought, and I'm sure my audience really appreciates your expert opinion on it as well.
Don't forget to go check out Flint's review of the Odyssey on his channel and subscribe to us both. Okay, folks. Time to pack up our finds and hang up our shovels. That's everything for this video. Where do you think Ithaca is? Was it even real? Did all the stock footage make you want to book a vacation to the Greek islands? Me too. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video or subscribe before you leave. If you're feeling extra generous, head to the links in the description to either give me a Ko-fi donation, shop my shelf, including the Legos on Amazon, or buy some archaeology merchandise like this shirt, which I designed by myself, all on Redbubble. Every watch, like, subscribe, and click helps my channel show the algorithm that people are interested in learning about real archaeology. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, and I hope to see you on my next adventure inside archaeology.